Welcome back, business law students. We are going to talk about contracts. Let's get after it. Now, you're going to have to run across contracts so often in your business career. Every time you sell something, there's either a written express contract or an implied contract. When you purchase things, you purchase inventory, there's a contract. Your employment contract, your union contract. Everything is going to be dealt by either a formal or informal contract. So let's arm you with the knowledge to know what a contract is, what makes a contract, what doesn't make a contract, and maybe the defenses you might have against someone trying to enforce a contract against you or your company. All right? Contract law. Let me do a little share here. Thank you for your patience. Okay. Well, first, what are the legal things that you have to have before you can call something a contract? Obviously, that's a legal term of art. That means it has efficacy, it can be enforced. So, what is a contract? Types of contracts. What's a quasi-contract? And then interpretation of terms. Well, to have a contract, it's often this is the way the book explains it. I don't like this as much, but since it's that way, we'll test it this way. But basically, a formal contract is really just elements one and two: offer, acceptance of the offer, and consideration. Consideration, payment, services, something that is exchanged between the parties. Okay. That one A and B and two really is a contract. Okay. So that's the important thing to remember. So anytime you're thinking back on it, somebody says you had a contract, was it a definite offer? Did you accept that offer instead of making a counter offer? And was there consideration, payment, services, something going both ways? The next two are really three and four are just defenses to the enforceability of a contract. So okay, what is an agreement? Just like we said, it is an offer and an acceptance. Now, there is a video, it's about 17 minutes long, but I'd like you to pause and watch this video on the screen because it really does a beautiful job of outlining offer, acceptance, consideration, etc. And by the end of that 17 minutes, you should have a good understanding of what contracts are. All right, now that you've become so much more, even more brilliant and seen that video, let's talk about types of contracts. And in this context, yeah, you can call it contract formation, but I think that's kind of meaningless. So, what is a bilateral contract? Basically, promise for promise. I'm going to do this, you do this. Okay. Unilateral, I'm going to get into that in a minute. Formal, well, anybody that signed a lease or bought a car or whatnot has signed a formal contract. Anybody that has shaken hands with a friend, if you pay for the trip, I'll pay you back. That is an informal contract, and it can be binding, frankly. Then, of course, there's express and implied. Express is written, implied. There are type of contracts or contract terms that the law creates, even if they're not written down on a piece of paper or digitally. Those are known as implied. We'll get to that in a minute. So, bilateral, unilateral. Let's try to watch this together. If you can bear with me.
ChatGPT is great for quick answers, but when you need,
Here we go.
Writing expertise, Grammarly is my go-to tool.
Offeree. So let's say we have Patty and David outside of Patty's house. In this video, we're going to discuss and distinguish bilateral and unilateral contracts. So let's start with a bilateral contract. In a bilateral contract, the offerer is going to make a promise, and she's going to get a promise in return from the offeree. So let's say we have Patty and David outside of Patty's house, and Patty makes a promise. She promises David that she'll pay him $100. But in return for her promise, she wants David to make a promise. So David promises in return that he'll paint Patty's fence. Good job, Patty and David. You now have a bilateral contract. David's promised to paint a fence and Patty's promised to pay money. So in our bilateral contract, we have parties making promises to each other. But let's say instead of two promises, we only have one promise. Patty says, if you paint the fence, I promise to pay you $100. So at this point, Patty's made a promise to pay. But David has promised nothing. And actually, Patty doesn't even want a promise from David. David accepts the offer by performing, by painting the fence. He's entitled to his money once he performs. Rewards or contests are usually unilateral contracts. For example, let's say Patty puts up a sign saying, "Lost dog, $500 reward." And David sees the sign. Now there's only one promise here. Patty's promised $500 to whoever can find her dog. So let's say David performs. He finds the dog. Now Patty has to keep her promise and pay the reward. So in a
All right, that's a good little video. I know it's simple, but I love something that's graphic that we can actually see. I'm probably a visual learner, but in any event, so now you understand the difference between bilateral, unilateral, and I like it's really how the contract is formed. And I really like the dog reward concept as unilateral. Just put it out there to the world. I promise I'll give money if somebody finds my dog. No one came out and shook your hand, but they just accepted your contract by performing. Okay. Now, and again, we're going pretty fast, and I apologize, but I do not, above all, I don't want to bore you. You got enough going on in your life. You don't need boredom. All right. Formal, informal, we talked about that. It's written, it's a form. It can be, and by written, it can be digital. You accepted a license online. You issued a purchase order online. It doesn't have to be hard copy. Informal is just your handshake deal. And again, in many respects, they can be valid. Express and implied contracts. Well, we already talked about express. You signed your lease for your apartment. That's obviously an express contract. It has all the terms in it. Implied can still be a contract. And even though you don't put it in writing or expressly say something, there's a good example here. Uh, keep returning to dogs, don't we? You pay a teenager to come over once a week and walk your dog. And on week 32, you say, "Meh, I don't want to pay." Well, this teenager has walked the dog, and during the past performance of both of you, there's a reasonable expectation that she would be paid for doing that. You didn't have to issue a purchase order, you didn't have to put anything in writing. She just did it. So that would be considered an implied contract, and you likely are liable unless you had said something changing the course. Do not dare walk my dog again, something like that. Another way that we can characterize contracts, obviously valid and void contracts. Void means there's no contract. I'll get into some defenses to contracts in a minute, but for example, if something's unlawful, Let's say I got divorced, God willing, my wife has kept me around for 30 years, but let's say she finally wised up and kicked me out, and then decided to hire one of you to run me over. Okay. Now, even though it might be justified, and you guys have signed a contract, you do that for $5,000 or the forgiveness of your tuition, whichever is greater. Um, it's actually not a contract because its aim, objective, substance is something that is unlawful. So that contract is void. And though, even though you guys both signed it, there never was a contract. Okay. Now, let's go back to valid contracts. So we start out and, you and somebody have signed the paint the fence example. Well, if you sign that and the guy paints it, it's enforceable. That's an enforceable contract. You've got to pay him for painting your fence. Now, some contracts are voidable, and it's a little, I look at the textbook for getting a little more in depth on this, but there's certain contexts in which the aggrieved party, the damaged party, one of the two that was harmed, if you will, by the actions of the other, has an option to void the contract, but doesn't have to. Right? So, for example, you order some, oh, sorry, what the heck's the name of those dolls that were big when I'm recording this? Labubu, maybe that's it. I always want to call it Lululemon. Labubu. Yes, I'm over 40. Um, Labubu, and they don't that they said they'll deliver in a week, but they don't get it to you for 2 weeks. Well, theoretically, you could void the contract, but maybe you want them so strongly that you don't void the contract. You go ahead and pay the amount. Next, unenforceable. Um, you can't enforce the contract, even though it was initially valid, because there are various defenses. Well, now keep in mind, think back about that one of our first pages. We said, here's the three elements of a contract, and then there's some defenses. Let's jump over to the defenses, shall we? Legal incapacity. All right. You are a child star, a singer, and a studio signs you up and takes 90% of your royalties. Well, the beauty is you signed it when you were 13. So when you turn 18, you can set aside that contract. Or you can set it aside when you're 14, just saying, I was a minor. It is not enforceable. By the way, in that case, usually they get a parent to guarantee it or something like that. If someone, let's say, for example, it's a severe mental disability, they've got brain injury, and you have them sign a contract to, give them your car for $2 or give you their car for $2. Well, obviously, the defense to the formation that is they had a disability. So they did not have consent, if you will. It truly wasn't agreement because they lacked consent. Statute of limitations, if you ever watched criminal law shows, you might be familiar with this in the criminal context as opposed to the civil context, which is what we're talking about. Basically, each state and many countries, as a matter of fact, have what's known as the statute of limitations, where you only have so many years to sue someone for something. So, criminal, for example, if you defraud somebody, you steal $10 million, it may be that they have to uh, convict you or charge you criminally within 10 years of when they find out. I don't know what the amount is, but that's an example of a criminal statute of limitations. By the way, murder has no statute of limitations. You're on the hook forever. In civil, I'll give you an example. If there is a tort that you have committed, car crash, you were looking out at your phone and you ran into somebody. Well, if they don't sue you within 2 years in Oklahoma, then theoretically they're barred from suing you. Contract. We sign a contract and you don't perform, and after 5 years in Oklahoma, I try to sue you, you just say, I agree that I didn't do what I was supposed to, but you only had 5 years to sue me. And the case gets kicked out. Statute of frauds, you'll see that in your textbook. There's some things that the law just said, that there could be so much fraud associated with this, so we're going to make some categories that things have to be in writing. If you sell real estate, um, goods with value of $400, a contract that'll take more than 1 year to perform, etc., they must be in writing. So if somebody does a contract with you, I need you to do this over the next 2 years, and you don't do it for 2 years, just one, and they try to sue you, you can say it wasn't in writing, theoretically. There's some other things. Mutual mistake, that means, of course, both parties to the contract made a mistake, not just one, but both. And that is, uh, let's say you got two old farts over 40 and they did a contract for the sale of a crypto. And since they're over 40, one calls it Methernet instead of Ethernet, and the other one says Mitcoin instead of Bitcoin. And it turns out it's a stable coin. It's a whole different coin. Well, theoretically, that contract can be set aside with the defense of mutual mistake. Both parties made a mistake. They didn't know what they're talking about. So you can just set it aside. Lack of consideration. Um, uh, Trying to think of a kid's example. You can have my piece of cake if you don't hit me, big brother. Well, and then you go ahead and eat the cake. Well, theoretically, it's lack of consideration. There was no payment following the contract. Obviously, there are bigger and better examples of that. Impossibility, impracticability, frustration of purpose, etc. A good example that we've seen recently is you sue somebody because they didn't deliver goods from China 5 years ago or however many years ago, and their defense is, look, there was a pandemic and our factories were shut down, so that it was impossible to do that. Another example, when I'm filming this, there's a lot of sanctions against Russia for their war against Ukraine, and um, so a lot of companies might have had contracts with Russia before the sanctions, but then they're able to back at them saying, wait, frustration of purpose. It would be unlawful for us to do it. So you can't sue us you can sue us, but we have the legal defense of either impossibility, impracticability, or frustration of purpose. Right. We're getting a little bit more in the weeds, but again, today we're kind of doing definitions. I'm sorry, it's kind of boring, but you just have to know all these definitions to first understand the contract, and then we can talk about contracts and how they're applied. Estoppel. This is another defense. Labubu, you didn't get them for 2 weeks, but then you go ahead and pay. Well, then you can't sue them and say you didn't get them to me in 1 week. It was 2 weeks. Well, basically, you have condoned the late delivery. So the court stops you or stops you from making that claim. Duress, that's a pretty good one. First one that I think about is someone with declining mental health in a rest home, and one of the nurses say, yeah, I'm not giving you your pain meds until you sign over your retirement funds or something like that. Well, obviously later the patient and or the patient's family can say, wait a minute, this person was under duress. Being under duress, they couldn't give consent. Being there's no consent, there's no agreement. Ergo, therefore, there is no contract. Fraudulent inducement. Sometimes you see that when people misrepresent a car. a house, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, this car's never been in an accident. And you wouldn't have bought it but for that, but they talk you into it because of what they say. This car gets 5,000, that's no one would believe that. This gets 100 miles a gallon. It's amazing. It's fraudulent. Well, theoretically, he can't then sue you to force you to buy it because there was fraud that induced you to enter the contract. Illegality, we talked about that. Unconscionability, that is an interesting one. Uh, I think a good example is your landlord, or even the university for that matter, makes you sign a really onerous, horrific lease to get into housing, and then tries to charge you for replacing an air conditioner, which wasn't your fault. Well, if I were a lawyer, your lawyer, I'd probably argue, look, for this student, it was take it or leave it. They were either on the street or they had to sign this contract. It is so unconscionable, so unfair. They really didn't have bargaining position. It was the day before class, and the housing unit said, you either sign our contract or that's it. So theoretically, there's an argument that bad terms on there, unfair terms, are unconscionable and therefore unenforceable. Now, there are some interesting uh, concepts where, even though there's no contract, many years ago, courts said, well, we've got to make a remedy for fairness. For fairness. They might be called a quasi-contract. Let me look at one example. Bear with me.
I want to be rich.
Your perfect domain is out there.
I'm
Go to
ready to
Wix
share, excuse me.
and make it yours. Claim your space online.
Now let's share elsewhere, shall we?
Please insert your stolen card now. PIN number.
Will you hurry up? This is taking too long.
Go baby, go baby, go baby. Alright. PIN number...
Who'd you learn this stuff from anyway?
From my mom. My real mom, I mean. Withdraw 300 bucks. Come on, baby. Come on, come on, come on. Yes!
Hey, it worked.
Alright. Easy money. Come on. Yes!
Yeah.
Piece of cake.
That her?
Yes.
She's pretty cool, huh?
No, she's a complete psycho. That's why she's up with Pescadero. It's a mental institute, okay? She tried to blow up the computer factory, but she got shot and arrested.
Oh, shit.
She's a total loser. Come on, let's go spend some money.
Yes, it was the Terminator. The concept in that movie is basically the bank didn't have a contract with the kid uh, who was a very proficient criminal, apparently. And let's say they didn't want to go to the press. In other words, go and have him arrested, because then everybody that saw his arrest and the explanation of it, oh, so it's easy to invade your ATMs. So it may be that a bank would then sue the kid. And in addition to fraud, let's set that one aside because we're talking about contracts, they might have a quasi-contract. And even though they didn't have a written contract and there wasn't a contract between them, this young man was unjustly enriched. He got their money, and it wasn't his money. So that's actually known as a quasi-contract. And they could sue them in contract, quasi-contract, to get their money back. Okay. All right. In a minute, I'm going to let you watch the Four Corners rule. And basically, let's say you have a contract and it's multi-million dollar contract, and your boss said you should never have entered that contract on the company's behalf. How do we get out of it? Because some of those terms, we don't know what they mean. Well, if it is a very vague contract, well, first, if it's a definitive contract, really there's not a reasonable differing interpretations of the words in the contract, then the judge would probably say, as I look at this and interpret it, I'm going to use the plain meaning rule. That is, if they're clear on the document alone. And so the contract is enforced, excuse me, according to what the contract clearly states on its face. In other words, I, the judge, will only look at the four corners of the document, the four corners rule of the contract. I'm not going to hear testimony. I'm not going to see emails. The contract says what the contract is. Now, there's some other things like it's some corporation clause right in it says this supersedes everything else, blah, blah, blah. Other rules of interpretation, as you see here, if let's say there are vague terms, okay, a a court might use specificity. He might use the history of how these people how you guys have conducted business. When you said the German term Schadenfreude, what did you mean in the past? And, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, the concept here is the judge will have different ways to interpret contracts if they get to his or her desk. All right, that's it for this week, and I will see you again next time.